Good morning and welcome to the brand spanking new Sandberg Center. It's a pretty awesome place. We're glad to be one of the first groups to hold our event here. My name is David Verrill. I'm the Executive Director of the Initiative on the Digital Economy, and we're very pleased to have you here today. It's going to be the usual drink from the fire hose today, but let me just sort of first level set us and make sure that everybody knows that why we're here and what we're doing. We are exploring how people and businesses will work, interact, and prosper in an era of profound digital transformation. That's what we do. That's our mission. And we've come a heck of a long way in just the 2.5 years since we've launched the IDE. We have more than 30 research projects with 8 principal investigators, more than 14 researchers, almost all of them here in the room today. We've put on 4 major events. We'll call this one the 5th, a bunch of lunch seminars that we webcast. So if you'd like to keep up to date on all of the interim research that we're doing, that's a good place to do that. And some smaller Jeffersonian dinners that are very focused on particular topics. And at the end of those, we give people a challenge to make change. And those have been very fruitful for us. We have 15 digital fellows, again, many of them here in the room. We've got 2 years of the Action Learning Lab under our belt where students work on projects that are proposed by many of you. We are going to launch our first executive education program in June. You'll hear more about that in a moment. We've put a huge amount of time and effort into an inclusive innovation competition. We have, I think, 6 companies here today that are exemplars of that competition, which will have its grand award ceremony in September, and you'll be all invited to that. And actually, this is the dates for what we're doing. Registrations are due June 1st, so if you know companies that are paying more attention to inclusive innovation, we'd like to hear from them. They need to be registered by June 1, and by June 15th, we'll shut down all the nominations. This is a $1 million prize, and it will go to companies in 4 categories, plus a wild card category that I'm sure will be surprised along the way, and we want to reserve some capital for those awards. We have some new faces, lots of new faces. James Manyika has joined our advisory board. He's director at the McKinsey Global Institute. Sunny Tambes, a professor at NYU. Lauren Hitt at Wharton. Tim Appel is here. Tim, where are you? There you are. And Jeffrey Hu. Jeffrey's our newest digital fellow. Jeffrey, great to have you. And we've had some additions to our staff. Christy Coe, and I think I want to single Christy out for taking on the task of organizing this as her first big event, the annual conference. She's done a super job. Thank you, Christy. I mentioned our inclusive innovation competition, and Devin Cook, Sloan alum, has taken that on as executive producer, and you'll hear more from her later on. Say hi, Devin. Shannon Farrelly has really souped up our marketing effort, and those materials and our branding are ever present. She's done an awesome job. Shannon, where are you? She's outside, I guess. And we have 2 new postdoctoral associates, Andre Fradkin. Andre, you're here somewhere. There you are. Thank you. And Irina. All right, I'm sure she'll be here later since she's presenting. We wouldn't have been able to do any of this without the support of our sponsors. We've doubled the roster of corporate stakeholders with the IDE. Accenture is our founding member, and we have nearly 24 other supporters, and we appreciate all of that support. I think most of you are here today. We've also had the great benefit of support from some of the leading private foundations across the land. The Ford Foundation gave us a launch grant that was really spectacular to get us rolling. The Joyce Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation are big supporters of our inclusive innovation program, and Hitachi's helped us put on the GIG event that we had a couple of months ago. Markel's funding some of our GDP work, and NASDAQ's been a nice prime sponsor for us, so we appreciate all of that support. And we've also had tremendous response from our alumni base and others. Joe Easton, Steve Denning, Erik and Wendy Schmidt, Joel Ornstein, Brad Fell, David Morgenthaler, and a number of others who prefer to remain nameless, but their gifts are nonetheless appreciated. So today, just for quick logistics, this is a drink from the fire hose format. We're going to throw almost all of our research projects at you in 15 or 20-minute increments. It's nice to do it that way, because if there's one that you don't get or don't care about, then you can maybe do a little bit of texting, but then I think the next one will hopefully bring you back with some interesting work. We're going to put table topics out for lunch, so if you could aggregate around those topics, people of like minds will gather there and talk about those particular activities. Presentations will be posted tomorrow at the latest. We are videotaping, so if you don't like your picture and videos, just put your hand in front of your face all day. Please put your phones on stun. And if you need to gain access to the Wi-Fi, it's readily available, but I'd encourage you to pay as much attention as you can to what's going on today. There are a couple of rooms on either side of this particular room where you can make private calls if you need to, and feel free to come in and out as you need. This room is our castle. We basically own this floor. Last but not least, I want to make sure that we gave credit to the organizers of this event: Christy, Susan, Justin, Tammy, Shannon, Devin, and Kristen. They're in here and they're out front. Make sure you thank them when you get the opportunity to do so. So this is our agenda for the day. I'm going to ask Erik Brynjolfsson to come up and kick us off. Erik is the director of the IDE, a professor here at the Sloan School, and the vision behind what we're doing here at the IDE. So Erik, come on up. Thank you.
Thanks, David, and let me add my welcome to all of you. I'm so happy to see you all here and see those terrific metrics that David just put up by just about every measure. This is the biggest, most successful, and hopefully it'll be the most fun annual conference that we've ever had. And we've had a blockbuster year in terms of research papers produced, books, new sponsors, and revenues. So we're really happy the way things are going so strongly, and I think it's a testament to the interest in this topic and also to all of the input all of you guys have been giving us about what's important and what we should be focusing on. And metrics is actually one of the things that we should understand better. And so this morning I just want to talk a little bit about a new research project we're just getting underway, and we'll talk some more about in the afternoon, that seeks to measure things more effectively. Just as we measure things at the IDE, we try to measure things in the whole economy. And many of you have talked to me about how it is that we should be measuring things better in terms of our GDP, productivity, and other statistics. It's something that I've been complaining about for years, and Andy and I and others have written about it, Adam Saunders and I, and now we're beginning to try to do something about it. So let me take a few minutes to talk a little bit about the issues with the official statistics and how we think we may be able to do something better. We'll talk a little bit about it at lunch and this afternoon as well. So let me start with a recent headline. You can read through the newspaper. The economy grew faster in mass than the US. And this is sort of the shorthand that people keep using when they refer to economic growth, is they look at what? They look at the GDP statistics or the state statistics of gross domestic product, gross state product. And that's a natural kind of shorthand. But the reality is that GDP is actually not a really good measure of how well off we are. What GDP actually is the monetary value of all the goods and services purchased by household, businesses, and the government. And people say that's the economy. And last night I was even talking to somebody saying, well, the purpose of GDP is to say how well off we are. The reality is that's not the purpose of GDP. That's not what it was even designed to do. But that's what the journalists use it for. That's what people use it in common business executives. That's what even a lot of economists use it for. Now, I don't want to say that it's a bad measure. It's actually, as Paul Samuelson, the Nobel Prize winner, and Bill Nordhaus said, arguably the greatest economic invention of the 20th century. It was a great set of metrics that were put together back in the 1930s, but it's not a good measure of well-being. It was actually created back in the 1930s by Simon Kuznets, and he specifically warned, do not use this as a measure of well-being, even though he was the creator of it. And he also got a Nobel Prize. In his Nobel acceptance speech, he pointed out that it misses a lot of what's really important by design. It's just something that they didn't try to measure in there. A number of people have pointed this out, that there are things like pollution or war or crime that can make GDP go up, even though obviously they make us worse off. If you break a window and have to repair it, that's a plus to GDP. Most people would consider that a negative to their lives. And there are lots of anomalies like this. It can go in the opposite direction as well. There are things that make us better off that aren't counted in GDP. And so almost all economists agree that we really should not be using this as a measure of our well-being. And people have fiddled around with other alternative metrics, even arguing we should try to measure overall happiness. So what I'd like to say is that the GDP mismeasurement problem, to some extent, has always been there, but it's getting dramatically worse. And the reason it's getting dramatically worse is that more and more of the economy is becoming digitized. And here at the Initiative on the Digital Economy, we're really focused on that. And let me show you why the digital economy is particularly poorly measured by the GDP statistics. And by the way, I should say that all of our productivity statistics are based directly on the GDP statistics. GDP is basically the numerator of our productivity statistics, output divided by input, either labor hours or a more complex measure of inputs. And if our GDP statistics are wrong, then our productivity statistics are wrong as well. So it ripples through our entire system of national accounts. So in the digital economy, we have more and more free goods, as you can imagine. Wikipedia is a perfect example of that. It has about 20 times more information in it than Encyclopedia Britannica, but we can tap into it for free. And there are many, many other free goods available in the digital economy. Now, GDP, as I said earlier, measures the value of all the goods and services purchased in the economy, so Wikipedia adds essentially nothing to GDP. Maybe there's a trickle for the electricity, the extra electricity you use when you have your screen on. I'm not sure that is a first-order effect. Ditto for all these other free goods that are available. And of course, that's the nature of digital goods. If they have low or zero marginal cost, then the economic system, competition is going to drive their cost down to zero. Or volunteers will be willing to create it because it doesn't cost anything to distribute it widely. And there's been an explosion of free goods, a dramatic increase. You can look at growth of Wikipedia, or you can just look at your smartphone and all the apps that you have available there, whether it's a GPS that used to cost hundreds of dollars or infinity 20 years ago, and now it's available essentially for free. Most of us have multiple GPS apps and many other kinds of apps that are available. And as Andy and I said in our book, it's really a whole layer upon layer of unmeasured costs and benefits. Unmeasured labor, unmeasured assets, unmeasured consumer value. And as a result, we're kind of missing most of the value in the economy. So here's another way of thinking about it. And I'm giving it just a tiny bit technical with some economics here. Those of you who remember your Economics 101 will recognize this demand curve here. We've got supply and demand crossing. And that triangle, that really big triangle, is the total what people are willing to pay for a good. The white rectangle is what they're actually paying. So you got a price times a quantity. That's the total revenue that you pay for a particular good, say a new smartphone or something like that, or a new car. And the colored triangle up above, that's the consumer surplus. That's how much you would have been willing to pay minus what you actually have to pay. So if you would have been willing to pay $30,000 for a car, but you only have to pay $25,000 for a car, then you get $5,000 of surplus, consumer surplus. And in some sense, with the real value from that car is not what you're paying. It's not the $25,000. It's the surplus you get. It's the extra $5,000. If you had to pay exactly what you're willing to, as much as you were willing to pay, then you get no surplus and you're kind of indifferent. So as long as there's you were willing to pay more than you had to, you're getting some surplus. And the real measure of the way the economy is creating value is how much surplus all these goods are creating for each of us. Each time we buy something, we are making a judgment that it's worth more to us than what we have to pay. So we presumably are getting some level of surplus from that good. If you add that up over all the goods in the economy, that's the total surplus that we're getting from the economy. And if you look at it closely, you see it's actually kind of the opposite of what you're paying. When the price goes down, your surplus goes up, which makes sense, but the GDP decreases. Now, for lots of goods and services in the economy, there's sort of a rough sense that, okay, we're sort of in the ballpark that if the good costs more, probably we're getting more surplus. Most of us get more surplus from our car than we get from a stick of gum. We get more surplus from 2 apples than we get from 1 apple. So there's sort of a rough and ready heuristic that the total surplus is somehow related to the total spending. But as you can see from this diagram, that's not really logically necessary. It just happens to be a rough coincidence. Maybe that was good enough for the 20th century and for Simon Kuznets in the 1930s when most goods had a significant cost. But we're now beginning to see a new kind of good, which is these digital goods, and the cost is going all the way down to 0. And now we're really having some serious problems here, because now the ratio between what you pay and what you get is going off to infinity. If you're paying 0 and you're getting some positive amount of value, then you can't really calibrate the value you're getting based on how much you're paying. Anything divided by 0 is not a really good way to measure your economic statistics. And that's what's happening as, say, Britannica replaces Encyclopedia Britannica. We potentially get a whole bunch of consumer surplus from that, but it doesn't show up anywhere in our GDP statistics. So that's a big problem, a switch from physical goods to digital goods. And as more of the economy becomes digital, every time those digital goods grow, we're missing that as well. So if more people start using Encyclopedia Britannica, and you see that curve shifting outward, we're missing all of that value as well. Because again, if we're only counting the cost, that black line at the very bottom that's 0, then we're not really capturing the value. So what should we do? I mean, this is a problem. It was good enough for the 20th century, but for the digital economy, we want to do better. Well, as the diagram suggests, what we want to do is we really would like to measure what is the surplus, what is the value that we're getting from these goods, not what we are paying. So how can we do that? Well, one way is to try to go out and do a series of choice experiments and ask people what they would have been willing to pay for things. And this is something that's been done in the marketing literature for quite a bit of time. Luckily, we have one of the world's experts on this, maybe the world expert here at the MIT Sloan School, John Hauser, who has done a lot of work on conjoint and choice experiments. It's becoming increasingly popular in some of the literature. It's used in expert witnesses. When Apple and Samsung sued each other, they had to figure out what these features were worth. And the way they did it was with a series of choice experiments. And essentially what you do is you test different price levels and see how many people would have bought it or say they would have bought it at different levels. Now, it's not a great measure because people can lie. I mean, they could say, oh, yeah, I would have paid $1,000. I would have paid $100. How do you know if you're really telling the truth? You know, economists like people to put their money where their mouth is to really know that they're telling the truth. And I have to say that this is a big weakness of this choice experiment approach. There has been some literature to scale this up significantly. For instance, you can use Google surveys to go to lots and lots of people, and you can give them side-by-side choices. And so that's one of the things that we're doing right now. We're doing a series of experiments with Aved Gamenemeshi, and Adam Saunders will talk a little bit about this perhaps this afternoon, where you basically give people a set of pairwise choices. Would you rather have the phone with a multi-screen there, you can see windows at the same time that costs $220, or would you rather have the one that doesn't allow you to do that for $200? And if you do enough of these pairwise matches and let people choose which one that they would prefer, it's kind of like going to the optometrist and they say which is clearer, A or B. If you do that enough times, you start getting a sense of how much people value alternative different features or goods and services. Now, it seems very tedious, but potentially you can do this for large numbers of goods and services and start triangulating on what the total value is. And we know now that doing it for a very large number is actually feasible in the digital economy. My colleagues Roberto Rigobon and Alberto Cavallo and others have done some research they call the Billion Prices Project, and they showed that it's possible to gather literally billions of prices off of the internet. You can get lots and lots of data off of the internet. And with the Google survey approach I showed you earlier, we can potentially get at least millions of these choice experiments fielded out there. To go back a little bit, Google has this survey system that makes it quite cheap to do that. Often when you log on to say, news publications or websites or getting Wi-Fi at airports, instead of paying cash, they'll put a little screen up there and say, please answer this one question or these two questions. I don't know if some of you may have done that. And they can scale that up very rapidly. I've talked to Hal Varian, the chief economist at Google, and he's happy to scale this up to tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of people, where we ask them these questions very unobtrusively. It will take people about a minute or so to answer them, giving them a choice experiments. There's also a version of it that runs on smartphones. So if we gather this data, we potentially could have very large samples of what people are willing to pay for different goods and services and start plotting out the total value of the consumer surplus in the goods. As I say, it's pretty scalable, and we'll be presenting it to a group of people from the Bureau of Economic Analysis this summer at the NBER to kind of run the ideas by them. We're going to do a small sort of prototype experiment, but we estimate that if you were to do it for all the goods and services in the Consumer Price Index, which is about, 80,000 goods, it would cost about $10 million to do that. Now, we're not asking you guys, the sponsors, to pay for that, but we will do the prototype, which for about 1,000th of that amount. And if it works well, then we'll go out and get funding. Well, maybe the Bureau of Economic Analysis will want to scale it up and reach all those people, and we'll start being able to get an estimate of the real value of the economy, not just what people are paying. So let me just wrap up by saying that for almost all our economic statistics, the news, the Council of Economic Advisors in the government, the Congressional Budget Office, they're using this set of metrics invented, to their credit, back in the 1930s that was actually quite useful, but fundamentally, even the inventor says this is not what you should be using to measure the value that we're getting from the economy. We've been using it because there's been nothing else available. Until now, until recently, it just wasn't feasible to reach lots of people. But now we have a digital infrastructure that allows us to do surveys at a scale and scope and cost that was unimaginable 10 years ago. So we can start rethinking how we measure economic value in the economy. And if we do this, we have the potential to reinvent the way we measure value. And one of the oldest lessons that we teach our MBA students is that you can't manage what you don't measure. And so it's time for us to start measuring the digital economy more effectively. There's a problem that's worse than it ever was before because of digital goods. There's an opportunity that's better than it ever was before, and we want to match together that solution with that problem there. So let me stop there and see if there's any questions. I think we have a couple minutes for questions, and then I'll introduce our keynote speaker. Go ahead, Michael.
Gross domestic product.
Yep.
But everybody, of course, for the past 50 years has talked about the service economy.
Yep.
What do you think is the most useful guideline as we shifted from measuring productivity in the service economy from digital goods to digital services? How does that product-service dichotomy figure into the way you're framing the metrics?
Well, to a first approximation, it should carry over. But one of the big weaknesses of that makes the GDP harder for services as it does for goods is that we're moving from a mass production, mass marketing economy towards one that's much more customized. You see that especially with services. Each doctor's consultation or a lawyer's meeting or a financial advisor, they're slightly different. Whereas each bushel of wheat or ton of steel or a Model T was more or less identical. And when things are identical, it's much easier to apply the gross domestic product approach. You just multiply the price times the number of units. When in the service economy, things tend to be much more unique, and it gets much harder to do those metrics. And so that's one of the reasons why you also want to have a larger scale, much larger set of numbers being measured going forward. Another question?
Even though consumers get these services for free,
yeah,
they pay for them through their tolerance to advertising.
Yes, that's right.
And is there a way of measuring what you're trying to get at through the advertising angle rather than through the survey angle?
That's a great question, because some of the services are just given away for free, like Wikipedia. Others, like Google, we know it's immensely profitable through their ads, and those ads pay for the services. So you might think, well, isn't the amount that you're paying for the ads equal to the value you're getting? And it turns out the answer is no. There was some important work by Michael Spence and Owen and others that showed that the revenue that you get from advertising is almost completely unrelated to the amount of consumer surplus. You could have something that has very wide appeal, but sort of shallow, and people don't get much value for it, but sex and violence on TV that people watch. This was the example Spence and Owen gave. And there is not necessarily a lot of consumer surplus, but everybody sort of wants to click on it and see what it's about. There's other things that may give a tremendous amount of consumer surplus that have a relatively narrow base. And so advertising is a fairly poor metric for the total value, but it's something you'd want to have in the mix. But unfortunately, that's not a shortcut to figuring this out. Yep.
I assume a consequence of the research is that you would begin to see that people who have digital access have an enormous amount of value that was unmeasured. And I think of it as an affluence effect, because those of us who have the benefit will have this huge impact on this hidden GDP, and those who are really have no access presumably have none of that. So how do you think about that as you approach
Yeah, I think that's exactly the kind of question that I can only speculate on now, but with the data, we would be able to know the answer. My actually instinct was sort of the opposite of yours, that there's a lot of people who have access to free goods, and maybe their living standards is better than we appreciate people who have access to entertainment and Wikipedia. It doesn't matter how rich or poor you are as long as you have internet access. Well, and I guess at least in the United States, most people do, so it may in some ways help level things a bit, but I don't know the answer for sure. We'd have to go out and measure and see whether or not the values were very different and whether this was associated or indicated greater income inequality or less income inequality, shifts around. Certainly your basic point that people who have access to digital goods and services are getting a lot of value that people who don't have it don't get would be true. But in the United States, most people do have access to digital goods. And worldwide, there's been a big increase in access to the internet. Billions of people are getting access to it. And so that would be indication that maybe these digital goods are becoming more widespread. But ultimately, it's an empirical question, and we don't have the data. And with this process, maybe we would get the data. So we could ask me again in about, I don't know, 3 years, and I'll have a number for you.